Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be diving into a topic that we've had a few discussions on before, but we're really going to go into the meat and potatoes of is cover crops right for you? Is it an option that you really want to consider taking? And we're going to be diving into that topic here very momentarily. But before we do so, it wouldn't be a Dairy Signal without a little bit of today in history. And today we're jumping to 1847. And it was on this day that the Donner Party was rescued from the Sierra Nevada mountains. And if you are not familiar, or maybe you're trying to scratch the back of your mind for history class in your middle and high school days, you'll probably get a little refresher here, as it was the first rescue happened on this day reach the surviving members of the Donner Party, which was a group of California-bound immigrants who were stranded by the snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains after deciding to avoid the usual route to California and decided to take a shortcut that was recently made. Spoiler alert, and unfortunately for them, it was definitely not a shortcut. It actually added about 3 weeks to their journey, ate up quite a bit of supplies. And then at the part where they were starting to cross the mountains, it was late October, and they made the decision of let's try it. And that was the wrong decision to make because a snowstorm came across and it stranded them there. Fortunately for them, about 15 I don't know if it's lucky or unlucky souls decided to try and reach help after being stranded. Only 7 of them made it to a Native American camp where they then were able to get word out. And in January 31st, a rescue party was launched, and it was on this day that the first rescuers reached them. So it was 3, 4 months of a grueling winter. And I think if you recall correctly, it was not a fun time for many of those, but I will leave that up to your imagination and or your Google search bar if you're looking to see what happened to those folks. But with all of that being said, we are excited to dive into today's discussion with Matt Omican, who's a part owner of Short Lane Ag Supply. And Matt, it's good to have you back. I know it's been a second, but we are always excited to talk cover crops with you because you've always got some new information or just some really good nuggets of wisdom that we can take away. But other than that, if somebody's joining us or maybe meeting you for the first time, would you mind giving them a rundown about who you are?
Well, hey, Amber, first off, it's always nice to be back. I love this platform. So yeah, and I also do love talking cover crops as well. So in case you're seeing me for the first time, my name is Matthew Omican. I'm one of the owners of an independent egg retail company called Short Lane Egg Supply. We got 3 locations and actually a fourth one going up now that's going to be west of Chippewa Falls in the Baldwin location. The other ones are in Pigeon Falls, Michigan, and then the home base where the home farm started. That's where I was born and raised, milking dairy cows alongside brothers and dad in Colby, Wisconsin. And dad launched our retail company in 1987. I was 2 years old. And then cows were sold once all 3 of us kids said we want to branch away from Colby to see what else is out there, go to tech school, go to college. I personally left to see what it would be like to be a school teacher and went to UW Stevens Point. And then the cows were sold at that time in 2004. And, from there, then Short Lane progressively got bigger and bigger. And here we are now. So now on the cover crop side of things, we started getting more aggressive with cover cropping in 2017. And then in 2018, me and my older brother, Craig, became advisory board members of the Old Plain Partnership for Integrated Conservation, which is it's a farmer-led watershed group. And yeah, and been part of that ever since. And yeah, kind of like what Amber said, each year we learn a little bit more. So anytime that somebody says like, hey, you got a wealth of knowledge on this, Matt, it's like, right. But that doesn't come easy, and it doesn't stop either. There's always something new to learn. And I feel like just anything in agriculture, there's more to unlock.
I definitely and couldn't agree more that there's always more to learn, and it doesn't just happen overnight, especially with something like cover crops, and especially if somebody's getting into it and deciding, is this the right option for me? And I do
Mm.
want to say that if somebody's watching and they're thinking, okay, well, what are we really getting in our into ourselves? Words are hard today. I apologize.
What are we
Uh,
getting into? What is this whole thing about?
Honestly, I feel that right now, but if anybody's wondering, like, what is happening besides me not being able to speak, if you're wondering more about cover crops, we're just going to kind of dive in here this afternoon. So if you want the basics or the lay of the land, if you will, we have other episodes with Matt that I would definitely go into your search bar and reference. But Matt also has a lot of really great resources out there. So also go tune into, I think you have a YouTube and a whole bunch of other places that you can find Matt and his resources, that may be helpful if you're trying to get the lay of the land as well. But Matt, I'm thinking about this last year and especially last fall. I drive a lot from western to eastern side of the Wisconsin
Mm.
state here, and I it's interesting which fields I go by and which ones have some green cover on them. And just thinking about, the discussions I've had with a lot of farmers and people in the world of cover crops, because I hear some more and more people different people every year who are trying some out, maybe seeing what works for them. And on the same flip of the coin, I hear some people who have been at it for quite a while who say, well, this year we aren't going to make it work, or we're not looking to do it this year for whatever the case may be it. But that's only my little pocket of the world. And I know that you have a lot more interaction with producers and farmers across the state and Midwest. So what are you hearing, and kind of where are people sitting when it comes to the cover crop conversation?
Yeah, it's kind of like, now when I'm going to say fork in the road, a lot of people feel like a fork in the road can be a negative connotation, but I think on a deeper level, the fork in the road means is is there more that we need to unlock and I need to push the envelope more? Or is this something that we just can't make into our system to make it work? And that also kind of like divulges into another mindset, and you can kind of feel how this turns into like an angst with people when we have these discussions of, well, if I feel like I can't make it work, do I know I'm maximizing my effort? Am I making the right approaches, whether it's seed selection, application wise, or am I just pulling the plug on it too soon? So that's the interesting part, because when you were saying traveling west and east, and I know we talked about this before we launched this, when I've been on my travels, there's been a lot of greenage in the countryside. Clark County has always been notorious for being kind of more brown than green going into fall, to the point where if I'm ever on any of these think tanks or these meetings or whatever with your UWs and stuff like that, sometimes there's kind of like a side joke of like, well, Matt's from Clark County. Not saying that there's bad farmers in Clark County. It's just that it's never been the full adoption rate that you see like in, Dodge County, down in Madison, east side of Wisconsin, where you have very, it's a different dynamic. But this year there's a lot of greenage. And to go further on that, when I was at the WASH conference, I did a roundtable discussion, and that was probably the most people that I had that attended those roundtable discussions, because I did it a year prior. And the top two questions were, is there more I could be doing besides winter rye? And then the next question was, I want to get into cover cropping, but I really don't know where to start, or I don't know how to make that decision whether I should do it or not. And just feel free to stop me here, Amber, at any point if I feel like this is going off of the wrong track. The people toss that around a lot of like, how do I know if this is right for me or not? Because there's a lot of limited resources. When I say limited resources, it resides in a lot of field studies, in a lot of university studies, a lot of your .govs.org people. When it comes to like the efficacy, the efficiency, success rate, the do's and don'ts. Whereas like other products like planting corn, planting soybeans, you have retailers, you have consultants, you have a wide gamut of information where somebody would say like, I want a midday early corn, and I don't even know where to start. You could open up a catalog between 3 or 4 different companies, and you could say, well, what kind of ground do you have? And you can narrow those choices down. Whereas in the cover crop world, it's expansive. It used to be pretty easy. Now, when I say easy, it used to be pretty narrowed, like a couple of different species. Let's plant it like as overwintering. But now it's kind of like this wide gambit of multiple species, multiple mixes opportunities. But then that opens up more questions, right? Like, how do I know which one's a better nutrient cycling one? How do I know if I'm going to stick with rye, I'm not going to get dinged on yield, or is it a yield enhancer? You know what I mean? So there's a lot of things you got to weigh out. And as much as I've done this before too. As much as we want to keep telling everybody, like, well, when you're operating your farm, you look at it as a business practice because it is a business, and you want to have long-term goals, long-term projections. But at the end of the day, it starts at planting and ends at harvest, right? Like it's a very short window when it comes to projecting those finances, and I totally get that because markets are just as volatile in agriculture, even more so than anywhere else. So when somebody wants to get into a system that they aren't familiar with, they just want to make sure that it's a sound investment and that they're seeing those returns happening. And sometimes it's easy to see, and a lot of times it's hard to see. And I Go ahead.
Matt, before you go on there, I mean, I think there's a lot I want to ask in here before we keep going because, I mean, that last point you made is, I think, spot on for a lot of people. It's the risk versus the reward in what you're doing. But also, as you mentioned, like when cover crops first really started coming around, there was not only a handful of options, and pros and cons to having only a handful of options. But also one of the cons for today of having a lot more options is sometimes you get a little bit of analysis paralysis, or like it's easy enough to do because everything starts looking the same, and it's what are your goals, and they all start to get muddled the more you look at it, unless you got a great resource to help you. But I really want to go back a couple steps here and talk about when we're talking about seeing more green. Specifically, you mentioned places like Clark County or wherever it may be. How much, and this is probably a little bit off of today's discussion, but I'm curious and I want to ask it before we're too far away from it. How much of what happened last fall do you think has to do with the interesting fall that we had? It was a chance, and for a lot of people, to maybe get into ground a little bit later. There wasn't the snow cover, different situations and variabilities. And I know there's pre-planning and you have to have some of this done quite a bit beforehand in order to even get the seed and get it done and have it actually grow. But because we had a dry, really weird into winter this year, how much of that maybe had a little bit of a chance to play with it that others might not have any other season?
No, that's an excellent observation, and 100%. The fall presented ample opportunity because harvest windows became weeks earlier than usual, and we had an 8-week stint where there was no rain. Plus, you had a surplus of slightly warmer than usual temps and a lot of sunlight to go with it. So the conditions were right. And even more miraculous too was a lot of funds that would be lumped as cost share that normally would be completely gone were still there. So there was people that I would say majority of the people that were pounding in cover crop, whether they were planning on it or not, majority of them just did it on their own. But there was others where if they wanted to try something different, like let's say like a 5-way species mix and they never tried it before, those cost share funds were there too. But I would say that was probably like 30% of the people that I worked with, where 70% were just like, let's go for it. I want to do like 50, 75 pounds of winter rye, winter trit. I want to see what this looks like. Or, hey, I'm going to try different seeding rates. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean like it was a massive amount of people that were trying it new. I would say, just off the top of my head, based on what I saw, there's probably 10 to 15% more acres that got put in with like winter cereals or cover crop. And that was based on those two. One being the major factor was the weather. If it can only be like that every year, right? And then, because this would be super easy. But if I can, speaking of last year, let's flip the switch. We talked about fall. Let's talk about spring.
Mhm.
Spring was a nightmare from coast to coast, top to bottom. And a lot of consternation, just as a whole, not just in the cover crop side of things, came from these overwintering field, or these fields that had an overwintering crop, whether it was like a hay field or winter rye, what have you, whether like cover crop or it was a perennial. They would not regulate that moisture like they were advertised to, or like they had done in the past. And that was a hard stretch, because that was a lot of conversations where it's like, Matt, I thought that this was supposed to suck this water dry, that I was supposed to be able to charge right out there, not rut anything up. And look at this, like my hayfield, like it is completely destroyed. So what happened? So soul searching a little bit and then talking to a few people, I found out what the answer was. So when we looked at the GDUs, so growing degree units, a metric that was used to measure like how hot and how sunny it was versus overcast and cooler temps, right? We were colossally low, even compared to a 10-year average. We're way, way behind. And it makes sense. If it's going to rain a lot, it's probably overcast. Doesn't rain a lot when it's sunny out. And sunlight is a big driver for the plant's ability to suck that excess moisture out and basically respirate it into the air. They just basically suck that water out and they're like, ugh, and then it just goes back into the air, into the plant and back into the air. So when you don't have the sunlight to help drive that extra plant growth and extra plant activity, it can only take in so much. And then the rest is going to stay excess. So Amber, did we ever talk about soil moisture from last year? Was that on this platform?
I honestly can't remember if we did or not. I
Can
can't
I?
remember about 2 seconds ago, so like I feel like we can go there without it being too off topic here.
So, so between the month of from early May to mid June, the UW Research Station in Stratford, Wisconsin, sent me their every day they took soil moisture measurements, and the average was 38%. So now somebody would be like, wow, a number. I don't know what that means. Imagine a coffee cup. Do you have a coffee cup nearby?
I do. If you're talking about my lovely ghost one.
Yeah. Woo! So imagine your boo cup right there. We go out to the field and you scoop up out of that field. And now we got the soil in there, right? 38% of that cup is pure water. That's what that 38% means. So now to put this into more context, normally that should be 25 to 28%. So like a rule of thumb, like a generic rule of thumb when it comes to like soil composition is that it's 25% water, 25% air, and the rest is like your organic matter and particles and all this other stuff, right? So when you think about how when that percentage is thrown askew, it's increased, you take away from something else. Well, that took away from the oxygen. So basically, we had a flooded basement in these farm fields that all these plants had to deal with. Yes, and it gets even worse. Let's talk more about that suck salad in a second. But that one, you had all this water with no sunlight to help drive it. So it's kind of like I have a flooded basement, but oh gosh darn it, Matt, we can't put any fans down there to drive out to help get that water out of there. And we don't have a pump. We're just going to have to take little buckets and just scoop it out, right? So that was one. And then on top of, yeah, right. And that top of that suck salad, when you have reduced oxygen, the respiration and access to that oxygen for that plant being reduced like that, it just slows the pace down even further. And that showed in corn as well, where corn was turning purple just because the phosphorus tie up was happening. And that happens when it's cold and wet. And that was like a massive indicator for me. And even talking to Jason Cavadini, that's the state grazing specialist. He's in Stratford, right by that research station too. Walking out in his pastures, it was soggy. It was crazy. So like you think about like on those pastures when it's thick like that, one, it's got the canopy coverage for the most part that people enjoy. Let's regulate the temp of the soil. But in this case, when it did get sunny, it was so thick that sunlight couldn't hit that water right away. So that even slowed that pace down even further. And that water just sat because it was just getting processed and absorbed by those plants that much slower. So when you think of it in those terms, do you chalk it up as cover crops can't work, period? Or was it, how often are we ever going to see a spring like this again? You know what I mean? In reality, the one thing that saved us from that season was when we had that 8-week stint of like no rain and just record sunlight. Imagine if it kept raining, what stuff would have looked like.
I think that was a lot of people's fear. And for somebody who's listening to probably our last 5 minutes, they're probably thinking, well, I got my answer right now that I am not doing cover crops. But I don't, that's not the moral of the story. That's not the message that we're getting across. It's that unique situations happen on both ends of the spectrum, hence why we mentioned fall and we're going back to spring. And I think that's an important conversation to have because we're in the process of dairy farming. We all know it's a roller coaster. We know none of it's perfect, and that you got to deal with the weather, and it's going to throw a lot of loops at you. So, Matt, going back to when you were talking about the WASH conference, and you were talking with a lot of those roundtables and the questions you were getting. So, one of the questions you were saying, like, where do you start? Where do you go? I think that's a very traditional and common question because it's where are those resources located, but also, what should they be asking that they aren't? I think that's another question that, you don't know what you don't know.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind, do you want to see some pictures?
Sure, go for it, Matt.
Are they up, Evan?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Oh, they're right here right now. Okay,
I
cool.
believe so. If not, he's going to get them there in 2 seconds. Magic.
So if somebody would go back to like one of our very early discussions, I had a PowerPoint where one of the things I said first was determining whether cover cropping is for you or not. There was a laundry list of different goals, and they ranged from, professional goals of like, well, I want agronomics, all the way down to personal goals of like, I feel like this is right, and I want to do something that, as a specific example, increase my relationship with the community or with my landowner. But for me, going back to that and going back to these questions from people at this round table and asking the questions that people aren't, is how important is it to be able to get in and out of a field? And then also, how important are logistics on your farm operation? And that can go both ways. So some people like the rye approach logistically. I chop the corn silage off. I'm going to turn right around and pound this in. Other people, that doesn't necessarily work. I have massive acres. I don't have enough people power to put this in. I don't have the mechanisms to put it down. So then somebody says like, well, what else could we try? Other things that I have listed on here, for things to ask yourself is, have you dug in your field systems at all? Especially in parts of fields where you don't necessarily understand what happened. So are you seeing this?
Seeing it.
So here's a snapshot. This is from this year. This is at my dad's field. So you can notice right away, like you see something on the left-hand side and something on the right-hand side. What does it look like?
So the second picture, or are you just talking between the overview?
The overview picture. Yeah, forget about that green picture off to the left. Like, gotcha. I'm talking about that field.
Well, looking at the field, what I see is on the left side, you definitely see a lot more green. It's still very like striated across, but compared from the left side to the right side of the field, it's green versus brown essentially.
This field, on the right-hand side where it's brown and it's that corn shorter and it looks like it's almost gone, that was a soybean field that was speed disked. It just kind of break up that residue. And on the left-hand side, that was winter wheat that we combined, and then we no-tilled in a smorgasbord mix. It had like 6 different species, mostly brassicas, got big, thick, and green. So then that following spring, we came in there, and then we planted corn across the entire acreage. And what you see on the right-hand side was that corn had more consistency. Yes, we still see our variability, but like that was the season. But you could see that it was much greener and there was more consistent height where that cover crop was. And then on the right hand side, it looks like crap. It was turning purple. It was hard to see. You saw skips, and it was inconsistent. You had big ones and you had a lot of small ones. And somebody would looking at that, they'd be like, "Huh, something was different." But when you go and explore it a little bit more, there was things that when you start digging, and I'm showcasing this on this slide, that really stood out. The cover crops had better soil profile stimulation. So it might have not regulated the moisture as much as I wanted to, but that was still a field that was, while we were waiting for other fields to open up, that was the very first one we were able to get into to plant because it had a little bit more stability than the other ones that had no cover. And then you could kind of see that in these two images off to the right, where, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
So like in this one, no cover, solid piece, hard to see the roots on that, like in between corn rows, right? On this one, we had an interseeding. It's full stimulation. You had roots all the way to the bottom. That was a kind of like similar what we saw in this field system here is that there was more soil fluff going on right here. This was just tight. And when I say tight, and you see these images, see how these corn roots, especially in this image and this image right here, they're very limited of where they're going and they're smashed and they're smushed. That's your compaction. So that was another variability that I found on this field. And then two, they're always on these biomass tests. It tests for like your wet yield, your dry yield, how much biomass you have on top. And then it gives you a hypothetical of like, well, this is how many nutrients we saw in the plant tissue. So hypothetically, based on its carbon to nitrogen content, this is the release of nutrients you should see. Whether those are real numbers or not is yet to be verified, but you can tell that you must have had a little bit of more of a nutrient dump here. You know what I mean? Like I don't have to have a degree to point that out. Like there had to have been something more to that. So that's to answer like that what I just said before is like, how often do you go out into those fields to dig around a little bit? Is something else you should ask yourself. You don't want to just drive past it or just sit in the combine and say like, I wonder what happened here. This is something that you should be going out there to kind of poke around a little bit and to make these observations and make these comparisons. And while you're making these comparisons, if you're looking at an image like this where you're like, I wonder if I'm maximizing my effort on this corn development where roots are very isolated. It seems like they're not spread out versus you see something like this where you're like, that's a really good root formation. I really feel good about that. That's something that a cover crop system can offer. Because if you look at the agriculture census that's done every 4 years in the United States, and it gives a breakdown per state, per county of a state, you look at Wisconsin, you basically look at like majority of like the agriculture states, not just in the Midwest, minimum till systems are increasing. People love that idea. And this is also going toward another question, in case you're not asking yourself that, is, am I seeing that minimizing my tillage is part of my balance sheet? It's on my spreadsheet for my operation that I'm eliminating time, I'm eliminating fuel, and I'm seeing immediate input savings by minimizing how many times I'm in and out of that field. And to me, there has yet to be another mechanism that is more prolific than a cover crop system when it comes to stimulating ground. So if you look back at these two images, like this one in the middle, this one right here, I've seen these in no-till systems, especially when it's like reaching 4 or 5 years. Because if you think about like a no-till system, you're not really stimulating anything other than I'm putting corn down, I'm putting beans down. And then let's even throw rye in there. I'm going to throw rye down in there. That's only 3 different kind of root types. So to me, you're kind of limiting yourself to only 3 root types that are stimulating that ground. So that also brings in that discussion of, well, do I need to have more? Do we need to incorporate like your brassicas, your legumes? Do you need to increase maybe more overwintering components to go along with that winter rye? But let's go back a little bit. So if somebody's like in a minimum till system, they're like, yes, this is what I need to have. Like, I don't want to spend money on a 3 to 4 pass tillage system. You need to simulate that ground somehow. And then that's a no-brainer candidate to have cover crops integrated into your system for the sake of soil stimulation and profile building so that planning is easier and you can alleviate those compact issues. And then I'm going to get back to you, Amber, here so we can keep the discussion rolling. The other one that I had on here was erosion control. At the end of the day, people are bothered by that. You know, there's one fella, he's my age bracket, and he gets in a bundle when he even sees soil particles sitting on top of snow that are drifting across the field into the ditch. People see that there's a value there. And have you ever told you the width of the dime per acre thing?
Oh, yes. Yep. Yep. Sorry. It took me a long time to think about that. But yeah, is the amount that, is a road words. I'll let you continue, but yes.
A width of a dime of soil equates to 1 ton of soil in a farm field. Just the width of a dime. And that's like a wind dusting, if you think about it. And if you think about like how much a field can gully out, all of a sudden you got lots of dimes, right? And soil takes 10 years to make the width of a dime, a decade. So when you put that in perspective, soil isn't just a vector. It isn't a sandbox for a farmer. That is an entity. That is the bread and butter. That's the moneymaker at the end of the day. That's where it starts and stops when it comes to what you're going to do for how much forage you're going to have, how quality of forage that's going to be, and where that yield is going to go. It starts and stops right there. So when you think about that, every little bit counts, even in the short gain, especially in the long gain. So those are the things that, and notice I never said the word soil health yet. Is anybody keeping track at home? I have not said that yet. And that's a lot.
They would be losing if it was a drinking game right now.
And I do that, and I do that intentionally because there's so much agronomic sense when it comes to managing your soil and your soil surface on these field systems. It involves field consistency, trafficability, your nutrient building. Everybody chases after this goal of like, I'm going to drop 100 pounds of urea or of nitrogen because I'm going to add these additives on there. But you have to build a system first. It is so hard, or probably actually it's impossible. I've seen enough Pivot Bio research. It's not possible to get to that gain because it takes a system. It takes time and you have to build it. And the only way you're going to build that is if you introduce more into that field system other than just a few different root types. It takes a lot of different measurements. So when somebody says that to me of like, well, I want to get more into nutrient building, then it gets into these kind of discussions of like, okay, let's talk about residue building or no residue building. Let's talk about how we maximize how much stuff that we're going to keep on the surface. Here's something interesting. So I stole this from a presentation that I was watching yesterday from UW Extension. They've been working with Ag and Water. Really, really fascinating presentation. So if you can see right here, they're talking about nitrogen leaching, how it equates to no cover crop biomass or if there is cover crop biomass. So take a look at this. So like August, September right here, granted it was a little bit dry, but take a look at this though, where we had a lot of cover crop biomass, no cover crop biomass. Whoop. This line right here is how much nitrogen was leaching. You know what I mean? All of a sudden you see that you're like, what am I leaving out on the table? If I could just integrate a system where I could hold it in place. You know what I mean? All of a sudden you're not talking like a wormy, touchy-feely tree hugger trying to save Mother Earth. All of a sudden you're talking like, guys, girl, we have a chance to maximize our effort here by integrating another system. So,
I mean, and it leaves lots of opportunity on the table when we're thinking about this in terms of, like you mentioned earlier, it's how much, risk, reward, return on investment, all of those make an impact. And it's not just, oh, we do this one thing and X, Y, and Z is going to happen. So making a system makes complete sense. But Matt, we had a question come in, and I think this is a good time to ask it. And this one reads, how much of my field type will make an impact on cover crop success? For example, low-lying ground versus hillside versus flat. And that's an interesting question because, I mean, for example, the photo you had before, it looked to be very flat ground, and that's, I don't want to say what people traditionally think of, but there's so much opportunity regardless of where you're at.
Yeah, if that person's from the Driftless area, my heart goes out to you because there's like some steep hillsides there. And that was something that that was asked to me too, where when they said field type, I said, well, soil type, no, field type. They're like, I want to interseed, but there's no way I can get my equipment in there because you'd be at this like hardcore angle. Um, Field type, especially the way that that was described of like low-lying areas, high, steep, those are all excellent questions. When you have steep grades, that's just increases the velocity of that water flow, right? It's just like your roof. The steeper the angle, the more that water wants to flow, right? And let's keep talking about water flow. Low-lying areas are an excellent candidate to try a cover crop system, even a vegetative buffer system. Let's forget about the whole cover crop thing. Even if you wanted to do like a vegetative buffer. So like everybody's got those areas. It's you're coming down with a combine and you're like, oh boy, let's not look at the monitor. This is gonna be rough. Why not take those acres out? Which is a question that not a lot of people ask. That's something that we did this year when we were working with this organization called One Good Idea, where we did a vegetative buffer. And my dad's like, you want me to take 2.5 acres out? Are you crazy? When you bring up the yield data on that 2.5 acre, it was on a field that was 30 acres big. On 2.5 acres, it dropped the yield average by 30 to 40 bushel field average. Wow is right. All of a sudden, you look deeper or closer at it on that 2.5 acres. Instead of trying to hit 160 or 170, we were getting 0 to 75 bushel. So why in the world would you spend the money to plant it there? You know what I mean? Granted, like if somebody's like, well, I need the forage, I get that. But like as a grain person, why? So you would just eliminate that. Or like if somebody wanted to say like, well, how would I know this interseeding is going to work out for me? If you know those areas are going to be on the low side of things and that corn's not going to perform as well, if that gets interseeded, all of a sudden you go from like a muddy bottom that you're going to have to like, you're going to rut up to all of a sudden you just go right across concrete in a normal year. But going back to that person's question, it gets tough because in that instance, if you're working with a lot of steepness, if your fear is having equipment tip over, it's probably better to focus on doing a cover crop seeding that's after the fact, after that corn is off, right? So like you can have your rye or winter wheat or whatever get pounded in and follow suit. Or if you were going to hop on the train of innovation or hype, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot more to these drones than I even knew. I was a huge critic of drones for the last couple of years, but after seeing how far the technology has come the last 5 years, it is amazing. So they're clearing 3 to 4 acres and they're carrying loads 50 to 100 pounds now. Like it used to be, they would only carry like 10 to 15 and they could only do like 2 acres. It was laughable, but it's gaining more and more. And it's because of those, like the question that was posed there, it's too steep. I want to try interseeding, but there's no way I can get across there. I hope that answers that question. That's what I would do. And then also based on field type, if you're really sandy, if you're heavy ground, cover cropping, interseeding, it makes a lot of sense. When it comes to sandier ground, you really got to hone in on what your species are. And you'll see more consistency with a cover crop system in sandier ground when it's done before the crop or after the crop. Meaning you have a small grain field, pound a cocktail mix on it, follow with beans and corn the following year. Or after your corn and beans are off, pound in winter wheat, winter camelina, winter rye, one of those two. Interseeding is really hard on really sandy ground. Like a brassica mix that you see right here on this picture, those systems are a rock star in heavier ground. In sandy ground, it kicks the shit out of the corn. So don't do it. I hope that answers that question.
I think it does. I mean, and if it doesn't, they can write back in, please do. But I think, when we're talking about, I mean, we're moving towards a little bit more of the differences, and we've touched on this before, but I think this is a good place to maybe talk about, you've got your grasses, you got your brassicas, you got your mixes. How do you know which one's which for what you plan to do? Because they all have their own scenarios in which one very clear, well, not always, but one clearly outweighs the other. For example, when you're talking in this case, sandy ground versus not versus, the different scenarios. So if you're somebody who's like, this all sounds great, but it's all mumble jumbo when it comes down to it, what do those differentiations mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the blends where it's mostly brassicas and pure summer annuals, especially when there's no grass in the mix. Um, for people that say, I don't want anything overwintering. I don't want any surprises in the spring. And I can understand that. Or for somebody that is needing an immediate nutrient dump. Like brassicas and these summer annuals, like your crimson clovers, your berseems, their C to N ratio is low, meaning they rot really, really fast. And so when they rot fast, they release those nutrients faster. So it's more immediate. Where when you have, let's say, your grasses, like your annual ryegrasses, but like more so your cereals, your winter rye, your winter wheat, and it turns into straw, that thatch has a higher carbon content. So it breaks down a lot slower. And there's more and more evidence that shows when you have a thick rye field and it gets really big and it has a lot of straw out there, you do have more significant nitrogen tie up because when all the bugs, and I'm talking like the bacteria, are pounding away at that straw trying to break it down, they need to have a balance between carbon and nitrogen. So when there's too much carbon, they need nitrogen to balance themselves out. And they start going after whatever nitrogen they can find. But that is alleviated when you upfront more nitrogen at the get-go. Meaning, hey Matt, normally I only do a liquid starter. I really don't do a lot of extra nitrogen. I throw a little bit of manure out there, and then I do most of that side dress. If you're going to do like rye, where you're going to say like, hey, Matt, I need thick cover. I want to have residue. I want a mat out there. I want to snuff weeds out. I want to have my soil covered. I don't want to do interseeding, and I want this to last for most of the season. Well, then you're looking at putting in extra nitrogen at the very beginning. Like, let's say 10 to 20 gallons of 28%. And maybe you add like some sulfur into that as well. Now, somebody would be like, that's a lot. I don't want to do that. It's all going to get burned up. That's not true. Because when you have a system in place where that soil is intact, it has those aggregates and it's stabilized, and then you have thatch on top where you're regulating how that moisture is interacting with the soil, and you can eliminate that erosion. Like we saw on this slide right here, we can eliminate some of that leaching. Then that nitrogen sits in place. It does. So now.
So that's,
Yeah,
you
go
go.
ahead. No, you.
Well, I was just going to say that makes a lot of sense, especially when, taking into consideration. And I want to move back to one of the first things that you mentioned when we were on here. And like when you were at the WASH conference, for example, and you said one of the questions that you had asked was, is there anything else besides winter rye? And so I want to bring it back to that because, when we're talking about all these and, all the options, there is some that, tend to stand out or rise above traditionally around when you're looking across. So let's go back to that question. Let's make a nice little full circle moment here and talk. Is there anything else other than winter rye?
So there's going to be 3 responses there. And Amber, I'm going to write this down, but I'm also going to count on you to keep me honest on there that there's going to be 3 responses. So first response is, well, if we're going to stick with rye and you wanted to have something intermingled in there, there's really only so many species you can pick from. So like there's winter peas, which winter peas can be easy to manage, but there's a lot that we don't understand. So winter peas want to be down deeper than rye. They also want to be kind of like planted a little bit later than what most people are planting rye. Some people are planting rye from September to November. Most it's going like October. Winter peas want to be like mid to end of October. So like some people are like, Matt, I'm not planting it twice. And I say, I'm not blaming you. So I would say like winter peas, me personally, it's a 50-50 shot because people will be like, I'm mixing it all together. And half the time it comes up and you're like, yeah. And then the other half, it's like, no, it didn't. Um, we've dabbled with perennial red clover a little bit, and that's been kind of hit and miss. If it's planted in early and we get a lot of nice surge of sunshine, which we've had the last several falls, it springs right back up. Looks pretty cool. Probably don't get the nitrogen credit building that you will because it's only so many plants, and sometimes the rye just snuffs it out. So you kind of sit there and you're like, was this the right thing to do? But otherwise, but like once it gets in October, it gets really hard. And then the next one, this goes out to my friend. He's at NRCS, Derek Rasper. If you never talked to Derek Rasper, have reached out to him, he's awesome. He's got a wealth of knowledge, and he's one of those guys that are just he's pushing the envelope every year with growers to the point where I'm just crazy jealous of this guy. So he's been working with winter camelina. It's a really interesting plant. Get it if you haven't Googled it, it's a really cool plant. Really awesome root structure, loves the cold. You can put it in a little bit late. It's been the second year that I've heard people working with it, especially with Derek. So I'm still waiting to see how that pans out, but that's probably another opportunity. But if you can kind of sense the way I'm talking, it feels like you're kind of limited, right? Whether you with rye, it's like, okay, well, what about rye and winter wheat? Well, you have similar species, so it's whatever. So that brings us to the second discussion. Well, does that mean I want to try interseeding? And interseeding, there's two routes to do with that. I love interseeding. And if anybody was coming down to Colby at our corn test plot, that was one of the best interseedings and cleanest interseedings we ever had. Just a rock star. Others didn't have that luxury. Got input in too late. Weeds became an issue, especially in dairy systems. If you don't tackle your weed pressure right away and sniff it in the butt and time it with a timely interseeding application right after, eventually you're going to get frustrated. And I've seen that enough times where, okay, I sprayed, I'm waiting 2 weeks or waiting 30 days, and then it doesn't get applied right away. Whether it's weather related, they're waiting for custom equipment to show up, and then weeds start showing, the stuff's applied. All of a sudden, it's just like, here's some water hemp plants, here's some lamb's quarter. So like, and especially in a dairy system, when you think about it, you're constantly re-inoculating those fields with weed seeds that survive in the manure, right? So there's been kind of a love-hate relationship with interseeding. People love the concept of interseeding, and there's people that have been doing it for years now, just as long as we have, and they haven't skipped a beat because you apply it, it's out there, and when the stuff comes off, it's grown. And then especially if you notice right here, according to Arlington Research Station, majority of the nitrogen leaching is happening between this time frame of April, May, and June. Well, by June, that's when you start seeing a little bit of that cover crop starting to grow. Granted, we don't get to hit it right between this April and May, but it's helping out in that June timeframe when we start getting a little bit of cover. But going into that third spot, if you want to get that cocktail mix, these cool mixes where it's a bunch of stuff like you see off on the left-hand side here, and you have the radishes and the turnips and everything's got blooms on it, and there's butterflies out around. You got to incorporate a small grain. You just have to. Whether it's a small grain that you're going to eventually cut, like forage oats, maybe you cut some trit, maybe you cut that winter rye and harvest it, and then later on, like July to August, you pound in a cocktail mix. And they're not expensive. Like seed-wise, you're looking, depending on what the seed mix is, you're looking at anywhere from like $13 for a mix all the way up to like how elaborate you want it to be, $30 an acre just on seed. So not completely unreasonable, but that's where you get your maximum effort. You get maximum root development, you get maximum biomass development, and then you can bank on that it's going to have maximum performance for soil stimulation and nutrient sequestering. And that's incorporating a small grain. Where people get sour about small grains, though, is they don't have a lot of knowledge of how to manage it. People like to think that you plant oats and forget about it. Not necessarily. Oats are just like corn. They need nitrogen and you got to do it at the right time. Um, but also when it comes to like forage wise, it's a nice system too, because you can cut that rye or trit. You could do a manure application and then you can follow up with a cover crop application. And then maybe even that fall, if you're like, dude, we got a full huge field here and we still have some manure that we can get out. You could do some injection into that field again. You see where, or for the first time, but you see what I'm saying? Small grains, somebody could be like, there's no money to be made on small grains. Like, I don't want to dick around with the straw and all this other stuff. But the other trade-off is you open up yourself a lot of opportunities. You have this big clean slate of like, I'm going to let this grow and we're going to follow up corn or beans and it's going to look great. Or you're like, I just created a huge vector for great fall apply manure and that stuff is going to sit there, which is, if you talk to anybody, you don't want to waste your time and money putting manure out needlessly. You want the stuff to stay there. Manure is not a waste. They had that at the Agri Classic at the WABA. Somebody showed that the biggest organic builder wasn't cover cropping and no tilling. It was manure applications. Not excessive, but it was systems that manure was added. So like, especially if systems that had no-till and cover cropping and manure had bigger gains in organic buildup than farms that didn't have the manure application or didn't have that cover crop aspect. So there's so many pluses to it. So as a dairy farmer, you want to make sure that that effort and that money and time is staying there. And you can't ask for a better way to do it than on stuff that has cover, especially that has root systems and has a soil profile that can take that on and hold it in place.
You really hit all three. You hit 1, 2, and 3 there. See, it made it real easy to follow along. But I mean, it makes so much sense. And like you said, manure, it is liquid gold in so many ways. And why see it go down? And I don't want to say go down the drain. That's the wrong phrase for all.
Down the creek?
Yeah, pretty much. Yes, but exactly. You don't want to see it go to waste.
Right.
I'm having terrible puns. I was trying so hard not to fall right into them. But Matt, as we think about this and as we go through and kind of wrap up today's discussion, there's so much more we could talk about, especially when deciding about, is this a consideration or do I do this or X, Y, or Z? But, from your experience when you're working with people who are just getting started and determining what's right for them, what separates the successful ones from the ones that are unsuccessful or maybe quit after a year of trying it because it didn't go quite as planned or perfectly as planned? So from your experience, what do you just wish that everybody knew going into it?
With cover cropping?
Yes.
That you can learn from your mistakes. And then, so somebody would be like, oh, I'm doing this wrong now. And that's not what I'm saying. Is a lot of it is people will stop something if like, I can't make this work and I'm done. I'm done with this because they feel like they've reached the limitation of how far they can push it or their understanding of it. But I would say that would be the when you ask that question, that's the first thing that came to mind is you can learn from these mistakes. And there's more and more that we're unlocking from this. And especially from like you saw from those UW slides, there is a glaring theme going on where we're losing out on opportunities for keeping the fertility in the field. And when you think of it in that sense, you're thinking more cost saving, more profit building than it is for the sake of like, for the environmental aspect. But there's something to that too. No farmer wants to be pointed at and said, you're not a steward of the land. Every farmer goes into farming with the understanding that this is a noble career. It really is. And sometimes you can feel frustrated of like, how do I know if I'm doing enough? These conservation practices help that. And not to mention when you can have a field and you can point at saying like, I know I'm not losing any soil or any ground on that field system. you know, and then you could point that to your community members. There's a value to that too, to me.
I most definitely, I have to agree. And I definitely think there is. And, Matt, I just have to say, as always, thank you so much for your time here today. I
I
know
know
that
we went over time.
well, no, we're good. I mean, it's one of those things where I appreciate your time because having conversations with somebody who, like you said, there's always so much more to learn, but you have such a great knowledge and background experience in this area to have these questions come through and give your complete and honest answer without realizing that you're not trying to tell them it's all sunshine and rainbows. There's pros and cons and there's things to consider. And I think that's
Right.
a very valuable and important information that sometimes people don't always get. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon and your insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, thanks for having me on. It's always fun to chat.
It definitely is. And I have to say, if somebody's out there watching, listening, whatever the case may be, if you're trying to learn and grow, whether it be cover crops or any other area in your business and farm, the best place to do that is with experts as well as peers. And I'm going to say, in a very biased way, that would be perfect for the PDP Business Conference coming up in March. On March 12th and 13th, we're going to be in Madison, Wisconsin, and you can really have a great time not only learning between the breakout and specialty sessions and our preview stages and everything else in between there. But you get to mingle with those who have maybe tried it, and you can ask those questions and you can learn from others' experiences, whether that be allied industry or peers in the dairy sector. So make sure you get registered. You can do so by heading over to our website. But with all that being said, thank you for joining us here today, and we'll see you here tomorrow on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.